Today we're going to be continuing our look at reclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, what that means, what that looks like. And over the last couple weeks, we've been looking at some of the gospel stories and seeing how Jesus interacted with some of the individuals that were part of his life, part of his ministry. And today we're going to look at someone that was pretty close to his life and close to his heart. But it was a person that was a chronic failure. If you can look, and we're going to look at several passages today, but it's going to be about one person. And we see the different things that happen in his life that show that just the failures that he had with Jesus as one of his apostles. And that person is Peter, the apostle Peter. And Peter, he was the brother of Andrew. Both of them were fishermen, and they were the first two that Jesus called to and said, "Come, follow me." And so Peter and Andrew, they were part of Jesus's ministry from basically day one. And Peter himself was one of the closest disciples to Jesus. Several times in Scripture, when Jesus would go off somewhere, he would take Peter, James, and John with him. And so he was one of the core people, the core group of disciples. And Peter lived with and worked with Jesus for about 3 years after he was called to follow him. But during that time, he had failed Jesus several different times. And the first thing we're going to look at is Matthew chapter 14, where Peter was a sinking failure. Matthew 14, verse 23 says, "Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land." So Jesus was off on his own. The disciples were out in the boat in the Sea of Galilee, and they were a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" So this first instance, here's Peter out in this boat, and the other disciples. The winds and the waves were causing chaos in that boat, and Jesus comes to them walking on water. And Peter, being Peter, he immediately says, "Hey, Lord, if it's okay, let me come out to you." And so Jesus tells him to come to him. And Peter is walking on the water, but he takes his eyes off of Jesus. He looks at his surroundings. He feels the wind. He sees the waves. And he begins to doubt. And he begins to sink. And he fails at that request. But Jesus says, he takes him by the hand, brings him up out of the water. "Why'd you doubt? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And so that was one of Peter's experiences. Another one is found in Matthew chapter 16, where Peter is a stumbling block. Matthew 16, verses 21 to 23. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. So Jesus was telling his disciples, here's what's going to happen. This has to happen. This is God's will. This is why I came. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. saying, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And look at how Jesus replies to him. Jesus turned to Peter, turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So here's Peter. Again, they're in the group, and Jesus is telling his disciples, here's what's going to happen. I have to go to Jerusalem. I have to be challenged by and struggle with the religious leaders. And they're going to ultimately kill me. But I'm going to rise from the dead. And Peter, again, he's thinking of what Jesus is saying, and he's like, never. You are an amazing teacher, an amazing prophet. There's no reason for you to do this. But to Jesus, he was a stumbling block. He was Satan himself. Get behind me, Satan. Because you're not thinking about heavenly things. You are thinking only of yourself. So there, he was a stumbling block. He failed his Lord. Another story comes from Matthew 26, and it's the unthinkable denial. Matthew 26, verses 31 to 35 and 69 to 75. At the end of Jesus' life, as he's going to be arrested and go to trial and end up on a cross. It says, "Then Jesus told them, 'This very night you will all fall away from me on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee.' Peter replied, 'Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will.' 'Truly I tell you,' Jesus answered, 'this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you.' And all the other disciples said the same. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. 'You also were with Jesus of Galilee,' she said. But he denied it before them all. 'I don't know what you're talking about,' he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, 'This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.' He denied it again with an oath, 'I don't know the man.' After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, 'Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away.' Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, 'I don't know the man.' Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, 'Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside and wept bitterly." This was easily the biggest failure that Peter had in his life. To know that what Jesus had said, he's going to go into the city. He's going to die, but when he rises again, I'm going to meet you back in Galilee. But you're all going to fall away from me because of me, on account of me. And Peter's like, there's no way. No way. Even if I have to die with you, I'm never going to leave you. And that's when Jesus tells him, you're going to disown me 3 times. Before the morning, in just those few hours. And that's exactly what happened. When he denied him the 3rd time, the rooster crowed. He realized his failure. And he went outside the city and wept. So now Jesus is crucified. Peter is devastated. We can't fathom. Maybe we can fathom, but just the failure of his failure towards the Lord. The weight of that guilt and condemnation is too much for him to bear. I mean, even when we have failures in our lives, the weight of condemnation is upon us. This was one of Jesus' closest disciples, who disowned him. We can't imagine the guilt and the condemnation, the agony of his denial of the man to whom he owed his entire life. Keeps replaying in his mind how he disowned him, disobeyed him, how he failed him. He's finding it impossible to shake that self-hatred that has gripped his soul. Yet despite his constant failings, something remarkable happens after Jesus rises from the dead. Mark chapter 16, we find out that Peter is singled out. Mark 16, verses 6 and 7. "Don't be alarmed," he said. These are the angels. After Jesus' resurrection, the women come and see that the tomb is empty. And the angel sitting there, and the angel says, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." God singles out Peter. The angels singles out Peter to hear the good news of the Lord's resurrection. The angel tells those women, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter." The one that kept failing me, the one that denied me 3 times, I want you to go and tell Peter of my resurrection. And Peter's not only amazed, but he is humbled. And he bows down in tears. And when he sees Jesus for the first time, now risen, all he can do is weep because of his failures. And during this time, Jesus never once mentions his denials that occurred just a few days before. Instead, Jesus commissions Peter, not any of the other disciples, but Peter, to feed his sheep. And we find this in John chapter 21, the unimaginable love that Jesus had for Peter and has for us. John 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus replies, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" But Peter says, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." And even though Jesus didn't point out or remind him of the denials, he restores Peter. Peter denied him 3 times that night. And after this meal, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" 3 times, restoring him for each denial. "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And Peter says, "You know, Lord, you know that I love you. Even with my denials, even with my failures, I love you." And Jesus accepts that love and forgives Peter of his failures. And actually then gives Peter the keys to God's kingdom. Peter is given the high privilege of opening the doors to both Jews and Gentiles. You see, the message of Jesus was for the Jews alone. But now, Jesus was opening the doors of the gospel message, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. And he was using a Jewish man, Peter, to get it started. And Peter receives this unexpected opportunity, Acts chapter 10, verses 9 to 16. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on a roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. So what was happening there? God was giving Peter an assignment to go to the unclean people, which would be the Gentiles. The Jewish people, they were God's chosen people. The Gentiles, they were unclean, not acceptable to God. And now God is telling Peter, I want you to go to those individuals because I have made them clean. Even though, Peter, throughout your ministry or throughout your time with Jesus, you failed him time and time again, even though you failed him by denying him at the time where he needed you most, he still loves you and he has an opportunity for you, and he wants you to go to the people that are unclean and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. And so he's given this opportunity to open the doors of the kingdom to all people, not to the Jews, not just to the Jews, but to all people. And so for us, what kinds of failures have we had throughout our lives? I know I've said many times, things pop into my mind of something that I did years and years ago. And it hurts when I think about it. And for whatever reason, while the enemy's trying to knock me down and reminding me of those things. And so we've all had failures throughout our lives. But there are some that have a failure that has negatively affected their relationship with God. And maybe you've experienced that. You think, I've done this thing. There's no way that God could love me. Now remember, Peter denied Christ 3 times, and Jesus still loved him. Based on Peter's experiences, we need to remember that Jesus is not surprised by our failures. He wasn't surprised when Peter denied him 3 times. He said he told him that was what he was going to do. So he's not surprised when we fall short, when we fail. We need to remember that he remains interested in our lives with him. Even when we fall and even when we fail, he's interested in us. He wants to care for us. He loves us unconditionally, even with the mess ups in our life. He still loves us more than we can ever think or imagine or even know. He loves us. Not only that, he has a purpose for each one of us to fulfill in this life. In Peter's case, he was given the opportunity, the commission, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, go to the unclean of the world. And Peter was given that purpose in his life to do that, to take the gospel message to the people around him. And know that he will lead us to where we need to be if we will just trust in him. Again, Peter goes up to the roof to pray, put in a trance. He gets this vision, and God is leading him to where he's supposed to go. And maybe he needed to be prodded a little bit to where, Peter says, when they say, go, kill, and eat, he says, I've never put anything unclean in my mouth. God says, don't call anything unclean that I have made clean. All I want you to do is go. I'm leading you to where you need to be. Just trust me. And that's where most of us are today. We need to know that He loves us and cares for us. He's interested in us. He knows our failures, but He still has a purpose. And that purpose involves Him. It involves Christ. And He will lead us to where we need to be if we will just trust in Him and His Spirit that's in us, guiding us each step of the way. Well, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Hope this message speaks to you a little bit about the love of our God, the love of Christ, how great a Savior that we have, that even in the worst of times, He still loves us and will receive us. But if you have any questions, comments, go to the website, livingwateruc.org, and I'd love to hear from you. Well, have a great week. God bless. See you next time.